Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be diving deep into Why Nations Fail.
Excited to dig into this one,
Yeah, this is a book I think a lot of people have heard of, but
but maybe you haven't had the chance to actually get through.
yeah, it's pretty dense.
It is. It's a big one.
You were kind enough to share some excerpts with me,
Absolutely.
and we're going to really focus on those for this deep dive.
Yeah, really get into the examples and the historical stuff that the authors use to make their case.
Cool. So to get us started,
Yeah.
imagine like you're standing on the U.S.-Mexico border right there in Nogales.
Right.
Same geography, same, families even, but like drastically different standard of living
Right.
depending which side of that line you're on.
Huge disparity.
Why, like, what
Yeah.
explains that?
Yeah, that's the whole question that Why Nations Fail is trying to answer, right?
Right.
And the authors Acemoglu and Robinson, they kind of throw out some of the usual suspects right away.
Love
They say
that.
it's not geography, it's not culture,
Not even like disease?
not even things like disease.
Have-
They say it comes down to institutions, the rules of the game that shape how societies function.
I can already tell this is going to be like really insightful.
It is, yeah.
I've always been fascinated by these kinds of like economic puzzles, and that Nogales example is
Yeah.
just such a powerful image.
It is, and they really use that to set the stage right.
Yeah.
They describe Nogales, Arizona thriving on the U.S. side,
Right.
while Nogales, Sonora in Mexico struggles,
Right.
despite sharing so much in common. So
Yeah.
it challenges our assumptions about,
Yeah, why some places are.
why some places rich and others aren't.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, okay, so if it's not those like traditional explanations, what are these institutions then?
Well, it's things we often take for granted, like property rights,
Okay.
the legal system, how much power citizens have to hold their leaders accountable,
Gotcha.
that sort of thing.
Okay.
And Acemoglu and Robinson, they break it down into two main types,
Okay.
extractive and inclusive.
Extractive institutions, that sounds ominous.
Yeah, like someone's getting the short end of the stick.
Exactly.
That's a good way to put it. The extractive institutions are designed to benefit a small, powerful elite.
Okay.
They're extracting wealth from everyone else, essentially.
So like a system that's rigged to keep the powerful in power? It
Exactly.
makes me think of like historical examples like the Spanish conquistadors,
Yeah.
coming to the Americas.
Oh, yeah, like Cortez and the Aztecs.
Yeah.
I mean, the goal was grabbing gold,
Yeah.
exploiting the existing labor force,
Mm-hmm.
The Spanish set up systems to keep themselves in control while everyone else provided the resources.
Yeah.
Classic example of extractive institutions at work.
So that's the extractive side.
Right.
What about the inclusive? What would be an example of that?
So inclusive institutions encourage participation. They're aiming to create a level playing field, uphold the rule of law,
Uh-huh.
protect things like property rights, encourage innovation, allow for fair competition.
It's interesting because even early colonial Jamestown, they kind of tried their hand at that extractive approach.
They did.
Things didn't work out so well for them at first, did they?
No. Their initial attempts to exploit the Native Americans and force them into labor backfired spectacularly.
Really?
It was only when they shifted gears and started relying on the colonists' own work ethic,
Right.
gave them land, created a system where there were incentives to produce and build
Right.
that moved towards greater inclusivity, even if it was imperfect at the time.
Yeah.
That was a major turning point for them.
It sounds like what they're saying is like inclusive institutions, good extractive institutions, bad. But I'm guessing it's not that simple.
You're right. It's not black and white. They acknowledge that even extractive institutions can produce economic growth, at least for a while.
Okay, there's nuances to it.
There are, yeah.
What would be an example of that?
Well, look at the Soviet Union in the 20th century.
Okay.
Massive industrialization,
Yeah.
rapid growth,
Yeah.
at least for a period.
Right.
But the authors argue it's ultimately unsustainable.
What are the long-term risks of economic growth built on extractive institutions?
They stifle innovation, they breed instability. Eventually, people get fed up.
Right.
Those inherent power struggles erupt.
Yeah.
It's like building a house on sand. You might get away with it for a bit, but the foundation is fundamentally weak.
Okay, so we've got these two contrasting types of institutions.
Yeah.
How do they actually play out in the real world?
Right.
I know the authors, they kind of take us on this journey through history to show how these institutional differences
They do.
have really shaped the destinies of nations, and they call them
Yeah.
critical junctures, right?
Critical junctures, yeah, they examine key moments in history that highlight the impact of institutions.
Okay.
These turning points where things could have gone one way or the other,
Okay.
and often it was the existing institutional setup that determined which path a nation took.
Let's dive into some of those. Which ones really highlight
Okay.
the author's point?
Well, one that always stands out to me is the Black Death.
Okay.
On the surface, you think plague, massive devastation. How could that be a positive turning point?
Right.
But there's a fascinating argument here.
Yeah.
The Black Death, wiping out huge swaths of Europe's population, actually shifted the balance of power.
Right. It's estimated that a third, maybe even half of the population died in some areas. It's just unimaginable.
Exactly. And because labor became so scarce, it actually empowered the peasant class.
Okay.
Suddenly their labor was in high demand, wages went up, and those feudal obligations that had kept them tied to the land started to weaken.
Interesting.
It was a shock to the system, but it ended up contributing to the decline of feudalism and the eventual rise of more inclusive institutions in parts of Europe.
So it's almost like a forest fire, like the
Right.
tragedy, but it clears the way for new growth.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Creates that opening.
Yeah, and it underscores how these seemingly negative events can sometimes disrupt the status quo,
Yeah.
create space for positive institutional change.
Interesting.
Another fascinating critical juncture they explore is the Atlantic trade.
Okay.
Now, the Atlantic trade created massive wealth, no doubt.
Yeah.
But its impact varied wildly depending on the institutions that were already in place.
So same event, vastly different outcomes depending on the rules of the game
Exactly.
in each location. Fascinating. What were some of the differences?
Well, take England, for example.
Yeah.
The Atlantic trade enriched a merchant class that was able to challenge the absolute power of the monarchy.
Okay.
It was one of the factors that led to the Glorious Revolution of 1688,
Right.
which, as we'll see, was a huge step towards more inclusive institutions.
Yeah.
But then in Africa, that same trade fueled the transatlantic slave trade,
Right, of course.
which ended up strengthening existing extractive regimes and hindering development for centuries.
Wow.
Same event, wildly different outcomes.
Speaking of events that reshaped the world, the Industrial Revolution.
Yes.
It offers a really powerful case study in how institutions can either accelerate or hinder progress.
Yeah.
How did that play out within this framework of inclusive and extractive institutions?
Well, the Industrial Revolution was all about embracing innovation. New technologies,
Well-
new ways of doing things.
Yeah.
The countries that had already developed more inclusive institutions like England,
Okay.
they were primed to thrive in this environment.
Yeah.
They had the legal frameworks, the financial systems, the skilled workforce.
Right.
That allowed for that kind of rapid change.
Mhm.
But then you have these absolutist regimes, places like Austria-Hungary and Russia.
Okay.
They actively resisted industrialization.
Why would they resist something that seems so beneficial?
They were terrified of upsetting the existing power balance.
They feared change,
They feared change, even if it meant falling behind economically.
even if it meant hurting their own people in the long run.
And that fear is often a hallmark of extractive systems.
Yeah.
They prioritize maintaining control over everything else, even progress.
It's like choosing to stay stuck in the past.
Yeah.
Okay, so
And that's a key takeaway.
Yeah.
The authors show how extractive institutions can create this vicious cycle.
okay.
Power and wealth are concentrated at the top, and any change that threatens that is actively suppressed.
Right.
It's a recipe for stagnation and often for instability.
I can already see how these concepts can help me understand current events in a new light.
Yeah.
But before we move on, can you remind me about Why Nations Fail itself?
Yeah.
I know it's a pretty dense book, and I haven't read it in its entirety.
It's a big one.
So, like,
It really digs into how institutions can either hinder or help a society flourish.
Okay.
And it's interesting to consider what those patterns look like in today's world, not just historical examples.
Yeah, that's what I'm really curious about. So we've explored these, like, big historical shifts.
Right.
But how are these same dynamics playing out right now?
Yeah. Are there any modern nations that really exemplify these ideas of extractive institutions hindering progress?
Yeah, that's what I'm curious about.
Absolutely.
Like, are there any that really stick out?
Yeah. And the authors don't shy away from tackling some contemporary cases.
Yeah.
One that really hits home is Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe. Do you remember that part in the excerpts where they talk about the lottery ticket?
Yes, I found that example so striking.
It perfectly illustrates how extractive systems can lead to a decline in not just the economy, but ultimately the entire state.
Right,
Mugabe rigging the national lottery.
right.
I mean, he was making a blatant power play.
Yeah.
It was a symbolic gesture that showed his absolute control and his utter disregard for fairness or the well-being of his people.
It wasn't exactly subtle.
It
It
was.
almost seems absurd, like a leader manipulating something as simple as a lottery.
But that was the point. It wasn't about the lottery itself. It was about sending a message.
Okay.
Under Mugabe, property rights were non-existent, businesses were seized on a whim,
Right.
and the economy was systematically destroyed.
Jeez.
It's a textbook example of how extractive institutions can create that downward spiral they're talking about.
It wasn't just about one corrupt leader, though, right?
No.
Wasn't it that the whole system itself?
Exactly. It's the institutions themselves, those rules of the game, that are rigged
Yeah.
to benefit the elite at the expense of everyone else.
Right.
Another chilling example they dive into is Uzbekistan and its cotton industry.
Okay.
And they highlight how it relies heavily on forced child labor.
Oh, that's heartbreaking to think about.
Yeah, children are pulled out of school to pick cotton.
Yeah.
And it all goes to benefit a small, powerful elite. And it's happening in a country that wants to be seen as part of the modern global economy.
Right.
You know,
It really highlights how these issues are not just relics of the past.
they're not. No,
Extractive systems are alive and well even in the 21st century.
very much so.
And they're not limited to developing nations, are they?
No.
I remember the authors talking about Egypt under Mubarak.
Yeah, Egypt had this veneer of a modern economy, but beneath the surface, it was all built on crony capitalism.
Crony capitalism where, like, connections are more important than
Attack.
actual talent or hard work.
The authors describe how even simple things, starting a business, for example, were impossible without being part of the right political circles. They mentioned this really telling example of the cinema industry.
Okay.
In Mubarak's Egypt, only 2 families were allowed to operate movie theaters,
Wow.
and it was purely because of their connections to the regime.
Jeez.
It's that kind of exclusion that stifles innovation and keeps a country from reaching its full potential.
So it sounds like the problem is these extractive institutions.
Yeah.
But what can actually be done about it?
Right.
Is it even possible to break out of these vicious cycles?
That's the big question, and it's one the authors grapple with. They argue that empowerment is key.
Okay.
They point to examples like the civil rights movement in the U.S. or the rise of the Workers' Party in Brazil, which eventually led to a more inclusive democracy.
Those are great examples.
These movements were able to gain traction and push for change because they empowered marginalized groups to challenge the status quo and demand a seat at the table.
Okay.
It's about shifting that balance of power, giving more people a voice.
So it sounds like it's about building a system where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, not just the select few.
Exactly.
But how do you go about creating that kind of change, especially when you're up against these powerful forces that benefit from the existing system?
Well, the authors stress the importance of a free and independent media.
Okay.
They look back at the muckrakers, those investigative journalists in the U.S.
Right.
during the progressive era
Yeah.
who exposed corruption and pushed for reform.
Right. Shining a light on injustice, giving people the information they needed to demand better.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were holding power to account. And that's crucial because when people are informed and can connect with each other, share their stories, it becomes a lot harder for those in power to get away with those extractive practices.
So information is power, knowledge is power.
Right.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But what about things like foreign aid? Can't we just throw money at the problem and help these nations develop?
This is where the authors get a bit controversial.
Okay.
They're not against aid altogether,
Okay.
but they're cautious about it. Their argument is that while aid can be helpful in specific circumstances,
Right.
like disaster relief or building schools,
Okay.
it often fails to address the root causes of poverty.
Because it doesn't fix those underlying institutional problems?
Precisely. And sometimes aid can actually make things worse.
How so?
If you're just giving money to a corrupt government with extractive institutions, you're essentially helping them stay in power.
You're enabling them to continue.
You're enabling them to continue those harmful practices.
Okay.
It's like giving an alcoholic more booze.
Right. You're not helping them get better. You're just making the problem worse.
Exactly.
Okay, so empowerment, a free press, a cautious approach to aid.
Yeah.
It's painting a much more nuanced picture of how we think about development and how to actually address these complex issues.
It is.
But honestly, it feels a bit daunting. Like, what can I as an individual really do to make a difference?
That's a question we all wrestle with. And the authors, they don't offer easy answers.
Right.
But they do emphasize that change starts with awareness. Once you see those rules of the game, those institutions that are shaping the world around you,
Yeah.
You can start asking the right questions.
So awareness is step one, and then from there, we can start looking for ways to support those who are working for greater inclusivity, whether it's locally or globally.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that this isn't just about far-off countries.
Right.
These concepts apply everywhere.
Okay.
Think about your own community, your workplace, even your family.
Yeah, you're blowing my mind a little here.
Think about those power dynamics, those unwritten rules that are shaping those interactions.
Yeah.
Are there places where those rules of the game are creating opportunities for everyone to thrive?
Right.
Or are there places where those rules are rigged, where they're benefiting a select few at the expense of others?
It's like those extractive and inclusive forces are at play everywhere if we know how to look for them.
They are.
I remember the authors discussing a lot of different historical examples to make their point.
They do, yeah.
Are there any that really stood out to you? Any that really highlight the long-term consequences of extractive institutions?
For me, the section on the collapse of the Maya civilization was a real eye-opener.
Interesting.
You wouldn't necessarily think of ancient civilizations when talking about modern economic issues.
Right.
But their story is so relevant.
Tell me more about it. What happened to the Maya?
So the Maya were an incredibly advanced civilization.
Okay.
They built these complex cities, had sophisticated systems of agriculture and trade,
Yeah.
but they were also ruled by a powerful elite that controlled every aspect of society.
Yeah.
And as that elite became more and more extractive, demanding more and more from the people while giving less and less in return,
Right.
it led to instability.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, their entire civilization collapsed.
Wow.
It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of concentrating power and wealth in the hands of a few.
So even ancient civilizations weren't immune to these patterns.
Nope.
Makes you realize this isn't just a modern problem, it's something that's been with us throughout human history.
Very much so.
But didn't the book also talk about some more positive examples?
They do.
Weren't there cases where nations managed to break free from those extractive systems
Yeah.
and kind of build a better future?
There are. And it's important to remember that
Yeah.
the authors don't want to leave us with a sense of hopelessness. They highlight the story of Botswana, which was able to avoid the resource curse.
Remind me what the resource curse is.
It's this phenomenon where countries that are rich in natural resources like diamonds or oil
Right.
often end up worse off than countries that don't have those resources.
Okay.
They can become overly reliant on a single commodity,
Right.
which makes their economy vulnerable to price fluctuations,
Yeah.
and those resource riches often fuel corruption and conflict as various groups fight for control.
Right.
But Botswana, they were able to use their diamond wealth to invest in their people.
That's interesting. How did they do that?
They built a more inclusive society by focusing on education and healthcare and strengthening their democratic institutions.
It's a reminder that even in challenging circumstances, good institutions can make all the difference.
Yeah.
So we've got ancient civilizations collapsing,
Yeah.
modern nations struggling, but also these like glimmers of hope, like Botswana, showing that it is possible to create a more inclusive, prosperous world.
Absolutely.
This book really takes you on a roller coaster ride through history.
It does.
It leaves you pondering some big questions.
Big questions, yeah.
In part 3, we'll explore some of those questions further.
Sounds good.
We'll look at what the authors suggest we can do to kind of shift that balance toward greater inclusivity
Right.
and think about what we as individuals can do to play a role in that process.
Important questions, yeah.
Until then, keep questioning those rules of the game,
Absolutely.
those institutions that are shaping the world around you.
Yeah.
How can we all contribute to creating a more just and prosperous world? Welcome back to our deep dive into why nations fail. So far, we've covered a lot of ground. We've gone from, those historical turning points that shaped the world to the very real challenges facing the world today.
Yeah.
And those glimmers of hope that things can be different.
Yeah, and it's important to remember those glimmers of hope.
Yeah.
We talked about those movements for empowerment, the role of a free media,
Right.
inspiring examples like Botswana.
Yeah.
All of that shows us that building more inclusive institutions really is possible.
Right. It's not a hopeless situation. And I'm really curious to explore what we can do to make a difference. In this final part, let's get into some of the concrete steps that the authors suggest.
Okay.
How can nations break free from these vicious cycles and move towards a more inclusive future? The authors don't offer, easy answers,
No.
but they definitely make a strong case for what needs to happen.
They do. One of their most compelling arguments is that prosperity isn't something that can just be engineered from the top down.
Okay.
They say it has to be grown from within a society.
So it's less about governments trying to impose specific policies and more about creating the right environment.
Yeah.
Kind of like what happened in that Nogales example, where the difference wasn't some grand plan,
Right.
but those underlying institutions that shaped incentives.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
about empowering people, giving them a voice,
Mm.
and ensuring that the rules of the game are fair and transparent.
Yeah.
That's what creates the conditions for individuals to work hard, invest, take risks, and innovate.
That makes sense. So it's not just about changing laws, it's about changing the whole system.
It is, yeah.
I remember the book talked about the French Revolution.
Oh, yeah.
A pretty dramatic example.
Yeah.
How did they view that event?
They acknowledge that it was messy, and obviously there were dark chapters,
Right?
but they also see it as a turning point in how power is distributed in society.
Okay.
The French Revolution swept away that old feudal system that had been in place for centuries.
Right.
It paved the way for a more inclusive society, at least in the long run.
Okay, so revolutions can sometimes be catalysts for change.
They can be, yeah.
But obviously, we're not advocating for violent upheaval here.
No, not at all.
Are there more peaceful paths towards building inclusive institutions?
Absolutely. The authors highlight how small, incremental changes can add up to significant shifts over time.
Okay.
They call this the gradual virtuous circle.
The gradual virtuous circle, what's an example of that?
Think about the reforms that happened in England during the 19th century, expanding voting rights, breaking up monopolies, investing in public education.
Okay.
These were not overnight revolutions.
Right.
They were hard-fought incremental steps
Yeah.
that steadily shifted the balance towards greater inclusivity, and they laid the foundation for that incredible economic growth that England experienced.
So it's about chipping away at those extractive institutions
Yeah.
and gradually building up those inclusive ones.
Exactly.
It's a long game, not a quick fix.
It is.
But we have to acknowledge that the world isn't static.
Right.
What about external events?
Yeah.
Can those outside forces kind of disrupt this process of change?
Definitely. The authors talk about those critical junctures,
Mm-hmm.
those moments of upheaval or opportunity that can completely change a nation's trajectory.
Right.
We've already talked about the Black Death,
Yeah.
a devastating event that ultimately led to positive change in some parts of Europe.
Right.
It's a good reminder that sometimes those unexpected events can create the conditions for change that wouldn't have happened otherwise.
So it's a combination of things.
It is.
Internal factors like institutions and external shocks that can create openings for change.
Yeah,
It sounds like the authors are cautiously optimistic
they are.
that even nations trapped in those vicious cycles of extractive systems can break free.
They do believe that, yeah.
But what are their main suggestions for how to do that?
Well, they don't have a one-size-fits-all solution. They're very clear about that.
Right.
Each nation has its own unique history, its own set of challenges.
Right.
But if I were to distill their wisdom into a few actionable insights,
Okay.
I'd say one of the most important is to focus on empowering people.
And by empowering people, they mean...
It means investing in education, creating a level playing field economically, and ensuring that everyone has a voice in the political process.
Gotcha.
It's about creating a system where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, not just a select few.
It makes you think about where we see those opportunities for empowerment happening in the world.
Yeah.
And where we see the opposite.
Yeah.
Where people are being systematically excluded or their voices are being silenced.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
And another crucial point they make is the need for strong institutions.
Okay.
Not just institutions in the sense of government agencies,
Right.
but those systems that create checks and balances,
Uh-huh.
those mechanisms that hold power accountable.
Okay.
That means a fair and impartial legal system, a free and independent media, and ways to prevent corruption from taking root.
So it's not just about having good laws on paper.
Right.
It's about making sure they're actually implemented and enforced fairly. And it's about having those systems in place that prevent power from becoming too concentrated in the hands of a few.
Exactly. And I think the author's warnings about development aid are really important to keep in mind.
Yeah.
They're not saying that aid is always bad, but they urge us to be more strategic and thoughtful about how it's used.
So no more just throwing money at a problem and hoping it magically disappears.
Right.
Yeah.
We need to focus on supporting initiatives that actually empower people,
Mhm.
strengthen those inclusive institutions, and create the conditions for lasting change.
Okay, so we've covered so much in this deep dive,
Right.
from, the sweeping historical narratives to the very real challenges facing the world today,
Yeah,
to those glimmers of hope that things can be different.
absolutely.
Is there a final message that you want to leave with our listener?
I'd say it's this: institutions matter.
Okay.
They shape our lives in profound ways, often in ways we don't even realize,
Right.
but they can be changed.
Uh,
And by understanding how they work those rules of the game that shape incentives and outcomes, we can start asking the right questions.
Yeah,
We can challenge the status quo and work towards a more just and prosperous world.
that's a powerful message. Institutions matter, and we have the power to shape them. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us into why nations fail. We hope you found it insightful, and we encourage you to keep exploring these ideas. What are those rules of the game at play in your own life, in your community, in the world around you? Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep working towards a more inclusive world.